Today we're going to learn about the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. First, I need you to complete the survey in the chat box. This just asks what you already know about the end of the Cold War. It's not for points, no tests, I promise. So go ahead and do that so we can get started. Awesome. Okay, so your objectives for this lesson are to identify key people and events that led to the Cold War and to describe how the Cold War ended. So let's get started. These are a few statues of Vladimir Lenin. He was the first premier or leader of the Soviet Union way back in 1922. Throughout the Soviet Union's existence and long after his death, Soviet leaders erected thousands of Lenin statues all across Soviet-controlled states. Lenin's statue was used as a propaganda and as a symbol of the superiority of communism and a symbol of Soviet greatness. So you'll see several Lenin statues throughout our lesson today, but decades after Lenin's reign came the Cold War. To briefly recap the Cold War, it was a long period of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War started right after World War II ended, and in 1945, and it lasted until 1991. The Soviet Union wanted to spread communism across the world, and the United States believed that communism was dangerous and wanted to contain it or prevent it from spreading. This led to spying on one another, to the arms race, where both countries drastically increased the number of nuclear weapons they had. It led to the space race, a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to dominate space, and it led to battles across the globe. These wars weren't fought directly between the United States and the Soviet Union, but both countries tried to help their side win. Soviets tried to help communists win or retain power, and the United States tried to help democracies win or retain power. Most often, both helped through military aid. For many years, the United States foreign policy was named after President Truman, called the Truman Doctrine, and it just said that the United States would try to prevent communism from spreading, also known as containment. So the Truman Doctrine was all about containing communism, while the Soviet policy was just the opposite. It was all about expanding communism. But all of these battles across the world to contain or spread communism, the space competition, the arms race, they cost the United States and the Soviet Union a lot of money. So by the late 1970s, both countries began experiencing an economic decline for different reasons. However, how the United States and the Soviet Union handled these new challenges is where we will start our journey today through the end of the Cold War. So the United States decided to elect Ronald Reagan as president in 1981. He promised to lower taxes, to improve the U.S. economy, and to defeat communism. Reagan's foreign policy plan to defeat communism is known as the Reagan Doctrine. While Reagan's policies led to increased government spending, his tax cuts did, at least temporarily, improve the U.S. economy. The Soviet Union was controlled by Premier Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev wanted to expand communism, while Reagan wanted to defeat it. These were essentially the same foreign policies practiced by both countries for decades, with the Reagan Doctrine just going a bit further and tougher than the Truman Doctrine before it. These policies were diametrically opposed to one another, Reagan's foreign policy and Brezhnev's foreign policy. The Cold War continued on throughout the first half of the 1980s. Premier Brezhnev continued to try to expand communism under the Brezhnev Doctrine, particularly by invading Afghanistan. The Soviets lost thousands of lives and a ton of money trying to prop up communist leaders in Afghanistan, but the Afghan people opposed this outside influence on their country, and they fought back with American help in a war that lasted for 10 years, with Soviets leaving Afghanistan in defeat. Oh, there's our Lenin statue. Praise the glory of communism in the Soviet state. Yay! Okay, to review, who was the Soviet leader when Ronald Reagan became president? Was it Bill Clinton, Leonid Brezhnev, Joseph Stalin, or Jimmy Carter? You can say it.
B.
Okay. Right, Leonid Brezhnev. Oh, look, our Lenin statue is starting to crumble. It's missing a hand. Oh no! But cheer up, comrades. Soviets control all of Eastern Europe. Communism isn't going anywhere. So Brezhnev is our leader in the Soviet Union during the Reagan presidency in the early 1980s. Awesome. So Premier Brezhnev's buildup of the military and aerospace industries left other parts of the Soviet economy deprived of money. As a consequence, Soviet agriculture, consumer goods, and healthcare declined throughout the 70s and the 80s in the Soviet Union, and it resulted in shortages and poor standards of living. This period was known as the Soviet era of stagnation. Soviet era of stagnation. Stagnation just means that there was an economic decline. This is a photo of Soviet civilians waiting in line for meat. So communism had promised equality for all and plentiful resources for peasants and workers alike. Looking at this photo, do you think that communism is working to help poor people access basic food needs?
No.
Okay. Do you think that Premier Brezhnev and other Soviet leaders were equal to average workers? Were they also waiting in line for meat and bread?
No.
Okay. No, there was widespread corruption, right, among Soviet leadership, and they were far better off than the average workers. So communism was not working for people behind the Iron Curtain under Premier Brezhnev's rule. Some brave people at this time began to protest against Soviet stagnation and corruption. Instead of making economic improvements in the Soviet Union, Premier Brezhnev reinstated some domestic policies of a previous Soviet ruler, Joseph Stalin. He cracked down on dissidents and protesters and anyone who spoke poorly of communism or the Soviet Union. Dear leader will not be questioned. Television, movies, music, news outlets were all controlled by the state. Anyone caught disagreeing with or denouncing the Soviet Union or communism could be sent to work camps indefinitely, confined to mental hospitals, or even executed under Premier Brezhnev's rule. That's not cool. Despite his failing health, Premier Brezhnev remained in power until his death. I always remember his face because of his really bad eyebrows. His replacements were equally as corrupt and brutal, and each one passed away, thankfully, within a few short years in office. There's old Lenin again. Praise be to communism and the socialist state. Okay, the period of economic decline in the Soviet Union under Premier Brezhnev was known as the era of stagnation, communism, battle of the bulge, or solidarity. Use your chat box or the mic to let me know what you think. A. Let's see if you're right. Yes, the era of stagnation. And look, Lenin has lost his whole arm now. Wow. This seems like it was a pretty bleak time for Soviet civilians, and there appears to be a growing disillusionment across Soviet-controlled states. But what do I know? According to the Soviet leadership, things are going awesomely, and the people love spending tons of money on war, waiting in bread lines, and substandard living and working conditions. There are indications that domestic and foreign policies of the party enjoy the unanimous support of all the Soviet people. So, my bad for thinking otherwise. Long live communism and the socialist state. Yay! So, in the early 1980s, we have three strong-arm, hard-line rulers in the Soviet Union, all dying within President Reagan's first term in office. Reagan's foreign policy, the Reagan Doctrine, was more aggressive than the previous Truman Doctrine in going after and defeating communism, as we talked about earlier. Reagan's rhetoric was also more aggressive. No longer were we willing to be nice about Soviet aggression and Soviet human rights abuses. Reagan called them an evil empire and said communism belonged in the ash heap of history. So tensions in the Cold War increased throughout Reagan's first term in office. And these are just some quotes by the two leaders, Reagan and then the final leader of kind of the Brezhnev era. He was after Brezhnev, of course, but he died. Konstantin Chernenko died, I think, about a year in office, and he's basically amping up the rhetoric a bit himself and saying that they don't really care about human rights, and that the United States is amping up problems, and of course, there's Reagan saying that Soviets are evil. So at this time, tensions are pretty high, higher at least than they had been prior to Reagan's term in office. And because everyone kept dying in power over there, then a new Soviet leader would come to power shortly after President Reagan won the U.S. presidential election to serve 4 more years in office. Mikhail Gorbachev rose through the ranks of Soviet power, and the United States assumed that he would be much like his hardline predecessors. But Gorbachev immediately called President Reagan to set up talks between the two countries. Reagan agreed, and a series of meetings was held between the two leaders. Gorbachev knew that the Soviet Union was in economic trouble. He knew that he could no longer afford to keep up with the Cold War arms race, so Gorbachev tried a diplomatic effort to reduce nuclear arms and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it worked. During these meetings, the two leaders developed a friendly relationship and they both agreed to reduce nuclear weapons. This new, better relationship resulted in lower Cold War tensions. Oh, there's old Lenin again. So who was the Soviet leader that met with President Reagan to reduce tensions and nuclear weapons? Was it Vladimir Putin, Joseph Stalin, Mikhail Gorbachev, or Leonid Brezhnev?
Gorbachev.
Let's see. Yes, Mikhail Gorbachev was the new leader of the Soviet Union. Awesome. Ha! But Lenin has lost another arm now. Wow, things are looking rough for the long reign of communism. But wait, maybe there's a solution. New Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev didn't just establish better relations with the United States. He also he saw economic decline, corruption, inequality, and protests taking place across the Soviet Union, and he called for a change domestically as well. Gorbachev was a devoted communist, but he believed that changes had to be made to secure communism and the Soviet Union. His policies of glasnost and perestroika were put in place to help the Soviet Union and communism to survive. The term glasnost means openness. Its goals were to include more people in the political process through freedom of expression. This led to a decreased media censorship, allowing writers and journalists to write about and report on the reality of the Soviet experience, instead of just parroting Soviet state propaganda. Glasnost also permitted criticism of government officials, encouraging more social freedoms like those that Western societies already had. Gorbachev believed that these freedoms would result in a lessening of tensions for Soviet civilians. Perestroika was the restructuring of the political and economic system of the Soviet Union. For many decades, the Communist Party had complete control over the government and decided who would lead, with no opposition parties allowed. Under Gorbachev's political perestroika, other parties were allowed to form and compete, and people could vote in a more democratic way for their leadership. Economic perestroika allowed for some private businesses and ended the price controls established by the government for the past 7 decades, 70 years. The goal was to create something similar to a free market system, or capitalism, which Gorbachev hoped would revive the struggling Soviet economy. So I remember the difference between glasnost and perestroika by looking at the word perestroika. Stroika has the same beginning sound as the word structure, and may help you to remember that perestroika was all about restructuring the Soviet Union. Just a helpful hint, hopefully. Back in the United States, President Reagan was pleasantly surprised with the democratic changes Gorbachev implemented, but he wasn't entirely convinced that Gorbachev truly wanted to provide more freedoms and openness for Soviet citizens. Reagan decided to visit one of the lasting symbols of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, in 1987, to make a call for Gorbachev to be the real reformer he claimed to be, famously calling on Premier Gorbachev to tear down this wall. But the wall stayed up. It was actually two walls that divided Berlin, Germany, with a dead or no man's zone in between, and they were monitored by armed patrols 24 hours a day. The Berlin Wall was installed in 1961 by East Berlin's communist government to prevent citizens from leaving for a better life under democracy in West Berlin. Imagine the city where you live overnight being divided in half by a huge wall. You probably have friends, maybe family members on the other side. You won't see them again for nearly 30 years, and they will live all that time under a government that doesn't allow them to vote or speak out in protest. They couldn't watch normal television programs like you do or listen to awesome music. They would have their own Soviet-controlled programs, music, and news, all of which praised the government that prevented their freedoms. But they didn't really know a difference for the most part, especially the younger people growing up in that society. Remember that for decades before Gorbachev came to power, criticizing communist leadership or even reporting factual information about the government within the Soviet Union would result in arrest or even death. But while more freedoms had been implemented under Gorbachev's leadership through Glasnost and Perestroika, these efforts at reforming the Soviet Union and the Communist Party only fueled more unrest across Soviet states. This cartoon on your left shows Gorbachev playing with dominoes. The big domino that says CCCP, that's just the Russian acronym for the Soviet Union. What do you think this cartoon is trying to say? Great ideas. Gorbachev's reform kind of set off a chain of events, like a dominoes that fall when you hit one. Um, and so this cartoonist believes that Gorbachev, while he was trying to secure communism, implement more freedom, stabilize the economy through Glasnost and Perestroika particularly, wound up setting off a wave of protests and a kind of domino effect that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. Um, so, excuse me, sorry. The protests led to the form of opposition political parties and candidates, which were now allowed under Perestroika, and these candidates who ran against communist leaders often won. In other states where communists continued to retain power, there were more violent clashes and civil wars. Oh, there's Lenin again. What was the name of the wall dividing the parts of Germany at this time? Was it the Munich Wall, the Hamburg Wall, the Frankfurt Wall, or the Berlin Wall? Yes, the Berlin Wall. Great work. Oh no, Lenin lost his cape. Oh no. How will the Soviet Union survive without the great cape of communism? Don't worry, Gorbachev is very much still a communist, and he believes that a little bit of revolutionary chaos is necessary to create a new and improved Soviet Union. And it's a good thing that Gorbachev believes this because lots of chaos is about to happen. Uprisings were taking place all across Europe, where communists still retained power. Protests were happening in communist-controlled East Berlin, too. The economy was only getting worse, and people were trapped and unable to leave. In an effort to maintain control, the East Berlin government drafted plans to make small changes to immigration rules for East German citizens. These changes were basically just a way to seem like they were being more lenient, but in reality, the tiny changes were just for show and wouldn't have had made much difference for most civilians still locked behind the Berlin Wall and hardline communist rule. But the communist government believed that the optics of change would reduce the protest. So they held a press conference to announce these immigration changes. But the East Berlin government spokesperson misspoke when that's his job, and he did it wrong. He misspoke when making the announcement and said the East German citizens would be allowed to travel to the West Berlin immediately, beginning at midnight the same day. You had one job. This caused a wave of excitement, and people rushed to the Berlin Wall. 3 million East Germans seized on the Berlin Wall. The communist officers guarding the wall had no guidance from East German officials and no information coming out of Moscow, the center of Soviet power. So they made the decision, instead of gunning all those millions of people down, that they would open the gates of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989, against the wishes of the communist leadership there. A massive street party formed, and the civilians began tearing down the wall themselves, and eventually East German military stepped in to take down the wall permanently. 28 years of separation between the two sides of Berlin ended in just a few short hours, but politically East Berlin's communist government was not willing to cede power, even if they did give in to immigration reforms, and the fighting and protests continued in Berlin and across Eastern Europe. Initially, Gorbachev promised to use force against all of these uprisings across Soviet-controlled states. Then he tried replacing hardline communist rulers with more liberal leaders, thinking that might make cooler heads prevail. Neither of these worked to stop the uprisings. Given the freedom by Gorbachev to speak freely, to protest, and to oust leaders they no longer supported, people across Eastern Europe now voiced their support for independence from Soviet control. Eventually, Gorbachev realized he was in a losing position and refused to use the military to attack civilians. So one by one, communist leaders throughout the Soviet Union lost power, and former Soviet-controlled states became independent countries with their own democratically elected or installed governments. All of this change happened in just a few short years. Glasnost and Perestroika were implemented in 1985. By 1987, just 2 years later, mass protests against Soviet control and for independence had spread throughout Soviet satellite states. By 1990, just a few years later, communist leaders were being ousted all across former Soviet-controlled states in favor of more democratic governments that represented the people of each country. So these are pictures of kind of like all of the places on your left, all of the satellite republics that were controlled by the Soviet Union, and they're all broken out here on the right after the fall of the Soviet Union. So all those countries gained independence. Oh, look, Lenin is still standing proud, extolling the greatness of communism. Okay, Glasnost allowed Soviet civilians the ability to work any job they wanted, have access to basic needs, speak out against the government, or to vote. Let me know what you think in the chat box or on the microphone. Glasnost.
Oh, that? I don't know.
Which one?
I was going to go with B.
Okay.
No.
No, Glasnost, remember, if you look back, let's try to go back. No, I don't think I can go back on this video. But if you remember back, the picture of Glasnost, let's see if this sets off your memory. The picture of Glasnost, when it's written out across the page, it's in a guy with a megaphone. And he's like yelling through the megaphone. Does that make it any clearer?
That?
Right. Speak out against the government. Right. So, Yes, Glasnost allowed Soviet citizens to speak out against their government. Remember the guy with the megaphone, right? A few slides back. So all of these protests were completely legal under Glasnost, and Perestroika made it legal for the people to oust their communist rulers and elect democratic leadership in their place, and that's exactly what they did. Okay, so things seem a little rough right now for old Lenin, but remember that revolution is all a part of the amazing Soviet plan. You cannot make a revolution in white gloves, just as Lenin said. Revolutions are messy, chaotic, and bloody. Somehow I'm sure this will all work out. But Lenin is now missing his head, so let's move on. A year after the 1989 demolition of the Berlin Wall, President Reagan's successor, George H.W. Bush, met with Gorbachev in the United States to discuss the reunification of East and West Germany. Bush and Gorbachev outlined a plan that would unite the separate communist and democratic spheres of East and West Germany into one nation, which has not been seen since World War II. A year later, hardline Soviet leaders saw the writing on the wall and an end to their power, so they made a play to regain control. In 1991, they staged a coup against Premier Mikhail Gorbachev and placed him under house arrest. The coup was poorly planned, however, and when Soviet civilians and even the military rose up in opposition, the hardline Soviets released Gorbachev. Boris Yeltsin, a Soviet politician at the time, organized the opposition movement against the coup. He had no love for Gorbachev. They were actually like vicious enemies, but he hated hardline communists more, and he wanted to gain support of the people. Some might say he was really interested in gaining power over the Soviet Union, but I digress. So when Gorbachev came back to power, it was only like 3 days later. He comes back to power and he realizes he's lost a ton of the support of the people and the remaining communist leadership. So he resigns from office and he grudgingly cedes control of the leadership to Boris Yeltsin, who's now a big hero thanks to his public demonstration against the coup. In that same year, 1991, Boris Yeltsin formally dissolved the Soviet Union. He began implementing a free market economic system similar to one in the United States, and he became the first president of Russia. The newly named Russia, I guess I should say. President Yeltsin and President George Bush signed an agreement in 1991 officially declaring an end to the Cold War and ending 46 years of hostilities between the two countries. Oh, so this seems pretty bad for glorious communism. The Soviet Union has been dissolved. There's now a president in Russia. What? Your move, headless Lenin. Which president followed Reagan and signed an agreement to ending the Cold War? Was it Clinton, Obama, Kennedy, or Bush? Bush. Yes, Bush, of course. And there goes Lenin. Nothing left but his shoes. And one more thing I forgot to mention. In 1991, Boris Yeltsin outlawed communism on Russian soil. And communism and communist symbols were banned throughout many of the newly independent countries that once made up the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union collapsed and one-party communist rule came to an end, so did many of the symbols of the alleged Soviet greatness. People had suffered 70 years under communist rule. Many took some of that anger out on Lenin's statues, just as they did on the Berlin Wall. Fun fact, one of Lenin's statues in Ukraine was left standing and transformed into Darth Vader and now provides free Wi-Fi for a free Wi-Fi hub for everyone in the area. Pretty cool. On the top right, if you don't see it already. Weird. Dun, dun, dun. So these are all just people kind of taking out their frustration on Lenin statues. They just knocked them down, or the government would remove them, depending on, which country it was. But it was, there are literally, there were something like 5,000 Lenin statues in Ukraine, and then they were outlawed, and so communism was outlawed. So all of the statues had to come down, and people took advantage of that, just like when they were hammering and punching on the Berlin Wall when it came down. One important thing to note about the end of the Cold War is how relationships, communication, and the exchange of ideas really helped to change the course of events in the Cold War. Gorbachev was a devoted communist, like I said before, but he and President Reagan formed a real friendship that continued long after their time in office. Reagan gave complete credit to Gorbachev for ending the Cold War. While this might seem like a nice gesture, remember that before Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, Reagan had increased both his rhetoric and his foreign policy measures to defeat communism and the evil empire of the Soviet Union. So that escalated tensions. Reagan truly believed that Gorbachev's request for talks immediately upon entering power and his Soviet reforms towards democracy and openness allowed Reagan to see him as a human being and not as an evil enemy, and it greatly improved relations between the two superpowers. And when Boris Yeltsin visited President Bush in Texas, he also toured a grocery store there. Yeltsin roamed the aisles, nodding his head in amazement. He told the Soviet entourage that with him that if their people, who often must wait in line for most goods, saw the condition of U.S. supermarkets, there would be a revolution. The fact that grocery stores like this were on nearly every street corner in America amazed Yeltsin. He later wrote that on the plane ride home he was despondent. Very upset. He couldn't stop thinking about all the food at the grocery store and what his countrymen had to manage to survive on in the Soviet Union. Yeltsin said that his experience at that grocery store in Texas shattered his views of communism. 2 years later, he left the Communist Party and began making reforms to turn the economic tide in Russia towards free market capitalism. So let's reflect for a few minutes on the end of the Cold War. Use the chat box, the mic, or the whiteboard to let me know, what do you think were some of the causes for why the Cold War came to an end? So some of the reasons will hopefully be economic decline in the Soviet Union, a thawing relationship with the West, reforms under Gorbachev. Great work, guys. And what people or events stuck out to you as being important to the ending of the Cold War? So some examples might be Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Reagan, Bush, Glasnost, Perestroika, Berlin Wall, etc. Okay, there's a quick survey in the chat box. Complete it to see what you've learned about the end of the Cold War. Just click on the link and we will have your collaboration guides ready for you when you are finished. Thank you so much for your participation.